So welcome everyone to the joint event between the Dialogues in Development series from the Development Planning Unit and the working group in the Southeast from the Association of European Schools of Planning. My name is Catalina Ortiz and I work at the DPU as an associate professor. Today we have the privilege to get our special guest. We will be discussing the book theoriSE, Debating the Southeastern Turn in Urban Theories. But as you know, as we gather here, the violence of the settler colonial regimes is relentlessly ruining vast landscapes and imposing ideologies of death. As Farzana Khan has said, if your heart is not shattered now, you need to examine the layers of privilege you have. We were hesitant to go ahead with this event arranged several months ago, but we decided to go ahead and actually embrace this moment and understand and reframe what does it mean actually theorize in this very historical turning point. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Chandrima, who's going to act as our chair.
Thank you, Catalina. This is a session being jointly organized by DPU UCL and Association of European School of Planning's Global South and East thematic group. We have three speakers today. I will briefly introduce them, and then we will start with their, each of them will tell us about their contribution to the book. To start with, Professor Oren Yevchel is a professor of political and legal geography, urban studies and urban planning, an honorary professor at UCL Department of Geography. Some of his books include Ethnocracy, Land and the Politics of Identity, Indigenous Injustice, Emptied Lands, and A Legal Geography of Bedouins in Native. Yevchel was an editor and served the editorial board in journals such as Planning Theory, Urban Studies, Journal of Planning Literature, City. Yevchel is an activist who have established and led several peace, social justice, and human rights organizations in Israel/Palestine, most recently a co-founder of Land for All. Our second speaker will be Professor Faranak Miraftak. She is a professor of urban and regional planning at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. Her scholarship is situated at the intersection of sociology, geography, planning, and feminist studies using case study and ethnographic methodologies. Her research concerns social and institutional aspects of urban development and planning that address basic human needs, including housing and urban infrastructure and services that support it. Our third speaker is Catalina Ortiz. She is a Colombian urbanist and educator passionate about spatial justice. She obtained her PhD in urban planning and policy from University of Illinois at Chicago, and presently she is program leader for the MSc Building and Urban Design in Development at DPU University College London. Her research employs decolonial and critical urban theory as well as knowledge co-production methodologies to examine the politics of space production. So we will kick off our discussion with Professor Oren Yevchel.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Chandrima and Catalina, for organizing this. I'm excited and thankful for discussing this book. This is actually in my hand now. It's a bit hard to see, but it is produced. It's also on the internet and free to download from the ACC, African Center for Cities. And I think it's very important that we continue this discussion about the critical approach to planning and colonial planning. And this, of course, I preface my talk with the day today, 29th of November, is the International Day of Solidarity with Palestine and Palestinians. It's undergoing at the moment a terrible disaster that is not detached, but it's part of what we are talking about. You can see behind me, I put a photograph of actually right around my neighborhood, many of the Bedouin Palestinians and the way they live because of planning around Beersheba. We're very close to Gaza as well, 30 to 40 kilometers. There is, of course, dialectics of violence in that respect, and we should remember all the victims of the conflict today, 29th of November. And I'm glad, Catalina and Chandrima, that you put it on that day, that you will remind the world that there is a whole nation that is under oppression and it deserves its rights tomorrow. Today, actually, and tomorrow. I also want to preface by saying that the book is dedicated to the late Professor Vanessa Watson. And opening of the book has a short description about her career and her pioneering work, about looking from the South, about the mismatch and the asymmetric power relation between knowledge that is produced in the global North and West and in the South, and how problematic and quite often disastrous it's been to import and impose theories of good planning, good cities, good space that originate from different societies through power relations on the 80% of the world, the 5/5 of the world that are not the global North and global West. So let's remember Vanessa Watson. She was very pioneering for years. Now, I have very few minutes just to introduce the book. I have 3 quick points, and then we will, have a second round. The first is the history of the book, how it's been produced. And the second is the different aspect and philosophies. And the third, which will be in the second round, is the different vocabularies and agendas for the future. So the book actually is a culmination of work of about 4 or 5 years, but it draws on a lot of disquiet and unease of people working in environments like Palestine, Israel at the back of the picture, but many other people that work in environment or work with environments that are not the wealthy, liberal Northwestern societies. And the unease was that a lot of the sorry. Okay. My family is listening. So a lot of the theories were actually termed in universal concepts. If you go to a shelf in a book and you look at the range of books, the city, the new city, the metropolis, etc., and you open the book, it's usually about New York or London or Paris. So obviously there is a epistemology domination of this kind of very powerful institution, but also there is a resistance that coming from very different fabrics, very different engagement, very different societies, and not reflected in these theorizations. So the aspect of universal theorization created a lot of unease. First of all, it wasn't applicable, and B, it reflected those power relations, and then emerged a group of scholars that say we are actually engaged theorizations from the South and from the East, and that's another discussion. Maybe we'll get into how this is emerged. But the idea wasn't to be dichotomous. It wasn't about creating a binary division, but rather to complement, to add, to offer alternatives, to offer different theories, because many of the theories from the global North didn't work. They didn't explain, and also they presented the logic and the power of people that were not present and they were looking from top down on our societies. So in that respect, it's very much the coloniality of the knowledge production that was very, very created a lot of unease. And so about in the last 20 years, 25 years, again, led by people like Vanessa Watson, but many others, in South America, in India, in Africa, in the Middle East, emerged a group of scholars that we actually made a couple of workshops, and one of them was at UCL about 3 years ago. And it was a very remarkable one. Many people came. It was a part of a big conference called the Frontier of Cities. And from that, a very, very lively discussion about whether we should actually theorize from the global Southeast. And it was a question mark. And there was a very heated debate. And on that basis comes the book. And we took inspiration from groups like TWAIL, which are the third world legal scholars that actually produce a lot of theories from the South, and from other scholars like Achilles Membe, like Mahmoud Mamdani, like Edward Said, and people that actually looked at the positionality as very, very fundamental to the production of knowledge and for the resistance of the imposition of knowledge from the North. And then an important part of it, of producing the book, is that when Nisa Mamon, my co-editor that I appreciate very much and thank her very much, and she is unable to be here today, we were looking for a publisher, and that was impossible. All the publishers were in the global North, And that's another landscape of power in academia that it's very, very difficult to find publishers that will actually do the work, produce good books, and they're in the global south. They're few and far between, used in Portuguese, in Hindi, in Arabic, but not in English. Eventually, thankfully, we found the African Center for Cities. And again, this was an insight to the power relation that continue to dominate the academia. And of course, have a marginalizing effect on people that produce very, very good knowledge from different parts of the world. And then the second point, I have about 2 or 3 more minutes, Chandrima, is about the production, the book itself. We decided not to follow the academic industry, not to go by the hard rules that produced by the big publishers, but to give people freedom, to have shorter pieces, to let them decide how they reference. Some pieces don't have any references, some have references, some have artwork, some have reference to music. We judge the input according to its own merits, not according to what the University of Chicago or Harvard University index actually dictates to us. So this was a very interesting exercise to have a publication like this, which the limits are very, very open-ended, and people produce very different essays and articles about the question whether we should actually theorize from the south or from the east. And of course, there is a big debate between the scholars about which we'll talk in a few minutes. But the format, I think, is a challenge to the Northern academia, which has become neoliberal. It's become imposing. It has formula to what to produce. It's rippled with citations. You have to cite 500 people and they will cite you. It's a type of industry that we wanted to bypass and produce something different. It's also very popular in the 6 months since the production among the students and among other scholars. And maybe to rethink the whole idea of academic production, which has been, I suppose, hijacked by the big industry of publications. So there is no ISI, there's no H index, there's no Scopus, there's not impact factor. We are offering a different perspective, and also it's free to download, which is very, very important in terms of knowledge production. So these are the 2 points I wanted to start with, the way it actually is a teamwork of many scholars, 17 scholars, and many more circles in the discussion, and also about attempting to do a different type of academic publication, which we hope, with our modest book, this is a modest book, but still we hope that other people follow.
Thank you, you're exactly on time. Can we move now to Farnak?
Sure. Thank you so much. I want to thank everyone, not only the audience, but Catalina, Oren, Chandrima for making this happen, this conversation. I appreciate it. Before I start, I need to acknowledge, as Oren did, that this meeting happens to be on the day that is the International Day of Solidarity for Palestine, and it's fortuitous. I'm inspired by a quote that my son recently shared with me in critique of so-called progressive hypocrites that, quote, they are against all wars except for the current one, against all colonial oppressions except for the ongoing one. And taking this to heart, we cannot, on this panel on southeastern or anti-colonial urban theories, engage in this conversation without recognizing the very current colonial condition of our conversation. So I am going to just flag 3 points before I go to my contribution to the book. Firstly, that we speak on decolonial planning in the context of the present colonial reality of an ongoing genocide in Gaza by the apartheid state of Israel. As was mentioned already. We speak, secondly, that we speak as part of ASOP at the gathering of planning scholars and practitioners in the European context And we cannot but recognize the implication of the European colonial states and their US ally in the ongoing violence in Israel and Palestine. Europe is complicit in the production of this unfolding genocide, and supposedly Europe resolved its problem of anti-Semitism on the back of Palestinian people. But this is not to just name and shame or anything other like that. It's to recognize our responsibility now, hopefully by the end of this session, when we discuss what is the prospect, what is our responsibility toward in respect to this kind of accepting the responsibility we have, and how could we address it through what kind of emerging actions and solidarities. That's where I will be going with my 10 minutes or so. And thirdly, planning as a profession, as we know it, is rooted in the colonial project of domination, whereby the profession's technical and discursive tools are often created and used to justify dispossession and displacements. I know these three were big items, but they are my departing points and platform from which I see and contribute to the conversation. So now I switch to what was the contribution that at least I made to the wonderful volume that Oren just introduced to the audience. I focused my contribution around two questions that was posed to the workshop participants. First question was, what is the relation among knowledge, praxis, and ethics in planning, and how could Southern theories help to decolonize Northern or Eurocentric power relations in academia? Second question was, how does a Southern turn in planning offer and require new vocabulary in language and in action, as well as new epistemic and scalar approaches to our analysis of urbanism and planning? There were several questions raised for the workshop participants, and I focused on these two. So main points of my contribution to the volume, I can't go over it. I just give you a summary of the main points. One was that on this debate of southeastern theorization, my main point is that we have to avoid seeing it as a geographic reference. It's referring to dominant groups, and it could be dominated populations in geographically north or south and vice versa. So that was an important point of departure for me. Secondly, planning practice is not the prerogative of professionals. This has been, many of us have been writing about it, working and showing that it is actually the grassroots, the bottom-up practices of everyday practices of people that is doing the bulk work of what we call as city building urbanism. But its professional planners have a smaller or less important role, you could say, to a certain degree for majority population. But just as in academia, we have had to work hard to establish the point that knowledge production is not the prerogative of academics. There is experiential knowledge and different forms of knowledge to be co-produced. I think in planning also this point is gradually being accepted. Thirdly, subordinate communities, if we are returning to people, to informal, to bottom-up planning practices, or some of us call insurgent practices, subordinate communities are gene pools of alternatives. If we seek alternatives to dominant formal planning, often serving as an elitist profit-centered agenda of the patriarchal racial capitalism, we need to turn to everyday practices of planning that take place in marginalized communities, resisting and creating the alternatives. And last point that perhaps was bulk of my chapter, and I don't have time here to go through, was about finding guidance in anti-colonial feminist thinkers, feminist methodologies and epistemologies that stress a relational approach. Relational approaches are capable of seeing the everyday practices and politics of resistance and life making. So that is where in a talk that I gave a couple of weeks ago, I focused on those feminist methodologies or anti-colonial methodologies and epistemologies. I discussed them more in the chapter. So let me explain what I mean by these summary points by drawing on the experience of occupied territories of Puerto Rico and occupied Palestine. While Puerto Rico and Palestine have distinct histories and configurations of colonial rule and governance, they offer us important insights as to limitations of planning solely defined by its formal professionalized practice, often through state and state-like institutions or market. One of my former PhD students, now Dr. Fida Araj, who teaches at Al-Najah University in West Bank, wrote her dissertation precisely on this question. What does planning mean for professional planning mean in West Bank? When water, electricity, transportation, movement of people, all of that is controlled by Israeli occupying forces, how do they define what they are planning and what is their role as planning? Similarly, in the context of Puerto Rico, a former PhD student and now Dr. Ariam Torres has dealt with this question of what does professional planning mean in Puerto Rico? And my own observations in Puerto Rico have pointed out that FEMA, or the federal agency, is controlling the money. Supposedly, they are receiving funding to decide for themselves, and all municipalities have been given the agenda of coming up with local development plans. But in reality, they don't make those decisions, and much of that funding has not been distributed. So the real work of recovery in Puerto Rican context was done by grassroots community-based groups, by what is called apoyo mutuo or mutual aid, and Ariam Torres calls it bomba planning, or those forms of locally created practices of care and assistance. In the context of Palestine, again, I shared this in another platform, the notion of sumud, or those everyday practices of care, of resistance, that you can't take our land, but you can't take our dignity, right? Those are the politics and practices, everyday practices of resistance, and not only survival, but keeping your dignity and your identity. Palestinians and the concept of sumud, resilience or steadfastness, is an amazing example that against all odds, they keep working every day in maintaining their cultural identities. In Sabra and Shatila, the refugee camp of Palestinians in Lebanon, in Beirut, they create these small museums, or one hole in the wall, you can say, one room, and objects that they have brought from home. They keep it there as a way of maintaining these transgenerational connections, memories, identities with back home. So those are very important practices that we should pay attention to if we want to talk about alternative practices of planning that is and theorize those, recognize those, conceptualize those as practices of planning that we will call it southern, southeastern, decolonial planning practices. That is where we should look for alternatives. I think I would stop here and allow the rest of the conversation to be in around the second round of questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Can we move to Catalina now?
Sure. So before I outline my contribution to the book, I would like to also raise 2 points following Faranak's example. One is highlighting also the ethos of the book and the way it was done. So rather than only the theory and what is written in the actual book, the strategy of sitting together in a circle, of binding a discussion and animating a discussion around central, thoughtful, deep questions. This, I think, is where the hope of, of the academia we want to see more of. And I think this is kind of the ethos that reverberates across. The other aspect is you even bringing in question why to theorize in moments where the futility of being an academic seems, very evident at some point. And somehow in the midst of despair, one wonders, and I think learning from what Cherry Moraga, a Chicana writer, has said, maybe we need to be thinking about theorizing in the flesh, trying to produce theory that speaks through the physical realities of our lives, our skin color, the land or the concrete that we grew upon. And therefore it becomes, it creates a politic born out of necessity. So I think we also write and theorize as the necessity to speak out in the face of utter silencing of many of the voices that don't, amplify the status quo. And with that preface, I would like to mention a few of the points that were raised in the contribution I made in the book. So mainly, I offered the concept of cardinal insubordination more as a provocation in the sense of trying to tease out and discuss something that Oren has proposed since the beginning when we started the discussion, that is using, in a way, a strategic essentialism of using the notion of southeastern theory. So in my contribution, I said that this idea of cardinal insubordination is a way also to question and to be cautious and not get too comfortable with these labels that can be dismantled easily, but trying to hold on the potential of bringing and bridging different set of urban sensibilities and try to understand these intertwined circuits that produce the urbanization that we inhabit. So my contention was that this idea of the cardinal points were kind of, in a way, the wayfinding strategy that the Imperial Project have used, and the use of cartography in its process was giving us, in a way, a blueprint to understand the world. But somehow we needed to resist, to rethink and analyze critically, what if we acknowledge that, but don't get lost or hung up on just a label in itself, with this Southeast having the risk of, in a way, getting us a residual perspective in terms of saying whatever is not part of the North and the West. So I proposed to center our work in what is the motivation, the what for, the aim, the horizon of actually theorizing, and as how I see it, this collective political project that is entailed in this work, and trying to think and understand what is the role of theory in this intellectual, ethical, and moral compass for liberation, emancipation, and self-determination. I think I put that as the horizon and trying to think from it. And by doing that, I propose 3 strategies, or rather guided by 3 questions. So where is the Southeast? And I propose this idea of remapping theory from the perspective of relational ontologies and learning from different iterations of theories, mainly coming from Latin America, trying to think about the grammar of the surroundings, trying to think of how to actually hack, in a way, the Cartesian tradition of the separation of body and mind, of body and land, culture and nature, and trying to put at the center ideas of the relational ontologies, and trying to think then how can we think through elsewhere, as Jennifer Robinson has put it, or try to actually decenter the perspectives when it comes to city-making processes. In this following this idea, I think it's very important to engage with the issues of how we connect the human, the non-human, and the spiritual worlds, that basically part of the hegemonic project of Western thinking is desacralizing the world. And I think this idea of connecting with this more spiritual and the non-visible real is also crucial to understand the territorial relations of meaning making that is central to the work that we do. The second point that I addressed, or the question that I raised as a provocation, is who's entitled to speak from and about the Southeast? And for that, I propose the strategy of shifting the master narrative through the colonial vocabularies. And here I brought some ideas introduced by several colleagues that help us to understand ideas of border thinking, of senti-pensar or sensing feeling, which I think is very central to what we experience today, and also very in line with these ideas of theorizing in the flesh, right? We cannot really focus only on the logos or in the rational element, but also bringing embodiment and bringing collective affection as something central, also to motivate and move the sensibilities that we want to bring together with the political collective project of theorizing from the Southeast. But also questioning who's entitled to talk about it, who are the theory makers, and what if we think the project of theorizing from the Southeast also as a project of counter-narrative or a counter-storytelling project, where the people that work with and actually produce the urban are the central also storytellers of a more radical, progressive urban realities. And thirdly, I was asking, how do we learn the Southeast and what for? And I think for me has been always of great interest thinking around how to learn otherwise and put together different ideas and methodologies and perspectives that can help us to work with the notion of critical urban pedagogies. I think the political value of engaging in pedagogy is something that we brought, and we have the duty to actually pay a lot of attention and devote a lot of our passion and intent to try to think together how to, a la Paulo Freire, to educate in hope and try to bring ideas of how to restore utopia and how to cultivate self-determination. And I think this notion of critical urban pedagogies could be one way to actually thinking in how do we learn about the Southeast and to what for. So just to conclude, I think the other final point in terms of what is, and to reiterate in this kind of political horizon of, what do we theorize from the Southeast, or what this entails, I think it's clear to me that we want to advance a corpus of thought and praxis that derives from multiple ways in which cities are shaping anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, anti-patriarchal, anti-racist, and anti-militarist endeavors. And it's in that process, in that project, where through the lenses of spatial justice and epistemic justice, we can make a difference. So I will leave it there.
Thank you, Catalina. So I'll very briefly go through what we are hearing from three speakers. Oren first spoke about the main thing, one of the things that actually resonates with what Professor Vanessa Watson was also saying, that Southern theory building, it's not an alternative theory. It's a project in parallel, and it's a project in building. So it has just started, it's in its very initial stage, and then there is a long way to go. And then from Farhan's talk, she spoke about colonial project contribution, how planning itself is a colonial project, and justified how planning has traditionally justified displacement and dispossession. So there was a generation before us. They were probably, if you speak about displacement within urban planning domain, they would tell you this is not something to discuss within urban planning because it's obvious for development there will be displacement. But then the thinking process has advanced over time. And one of the things I really liked about her talk is she's speaking about who is entitled to produce knowledge. So knowledge is not just being produced by academics, but it's a job of both academics and practitioners. And here I would like to refer a bit, because all of you spoke about also new vocabularies. So new vocabularies, the Gautam Man's list of vocabularies, the way he has introduced. And then we were doing a special issue from Global South and East Group, where there were 3 young academics from Argentina, Australia, and Brazil. And they were also coming up with their own set of vocabularies. So this list will have to be extended, and both academics and practitioners, so the budding planners, whether they are going to be in academia or practice, they have the responsibility to extend it. Finally, with Catalina's provocation on cardinal subordination, she asked the question about where is Southeast? So it's not just a geographic concept, but it's also about relational ontology. And then the second one is who is entitled to speak from Southeast. And then finally, she speaks about critical pedagogy. Now, in the second round, we would like to ask the speakers about how do you see the future of, or the emerging areas of the Southeastern Theory Building Project? What are the prospects of the Southeastern Theory Building Project? We could go in the same sequence, or if one of you just want to jump in, that's fine.
Okay, I'll start. Thank you very much for Catalina and Faranak for very insightful elaboration on the contribution to the book, and very much echoing the discussion kind of atmosphere that we had that inspired all of us to develop in different directions. I want to also acknowledge the committee or the group that actually organized it, which had Libby Porter from Melbourne and had Gautam Ban from Delhi, Bangalore. It had Raj Balakrishnan, who is from Tamil Nadu, but now also in America, and Jennifer Robinson, who actually hosted it, and she organized it. She was really a great source of energy and inspiration as well. So all these people are with us in the organizer committee, and of course the rounds of people that were there for 3 days and brainstormed endlessly. Now, the main question that is already echoing here and on which we build also the future orientation was whether it's actually where it is useful, insightful, necessary to invoke the idea of the global South and East, and I'll talk about both, and how does it help us? So my position, which is outlined in the introduction to the book, is that it's a necessary intervention. It's a necessary intervention in a discourse developed in urban studies and in planning, which already noted was very northern oriented, was rooted in colonial history and in colonial tropes, not, by the way, only north on south, but also north on north. For example, a lot of urban clearance, about what is called urban renewal, about of the projects of urban construction is, of course, taking over and exploiting the land and people for profits that actually usually are taken towards different echelons or the higher echelons of society. So there is a lot of literature too that is about planning in general. And of course, planning is also a double-edged sword because it has a philosophy and a history of correcting, of justice, of actually intervening where land development and spatial development is actually oppressive. So there is also a long tradition in planning about resisting. And then when it moves itself to the global South and East, it's also decolonial because of the history of the project of development, which, as we already said, originate in the takeover for 500 years. For 500 years, the rest of the world was taken over by a small group of people from Europe. So just think about it in global terms and see how it influences every space: Australia, Indonesia, India, Africa, South America, etc. So that question, I think I answered, it's a necessary intervention to open up and bring different angles into the debate. Positionality is very critical. So as Donna Haraway told us, no one can write from nowhere. So it's very, very important to be engaged, to be enmeshed, to be embodied, like Catalina said, in order to produce the knowledge and to be open about it, and not to pretend that you write from nowhere. And that intervention actually had a reaction And the main theorists of the global north were very unhappy about it. And there was a stream of articles, one of them by Michael Stopper and Alan Scott, quite famously, that actually even won some awards. And they were hammering people that write from the global south and east, saying it's just an aberration. There's no real difference. It's right, an aberration. And I remember Vanessa Watson and Amber Nejo and Achilles Member answering to them and actually proving that the view that one size fits all from the north is so deeply flawed. It's not an aberration. It's a different mode of production. Just look what's the picture behind me. That's not an aberration. It's a mode of production, of course, built on all kind of forces, but very, very different process of urbanization and social construction. Now, having said that, it's a necessary intervention. I want to have a caveat. The geography of it, as already Fahrenheit and Catalina were saying, is not fixed. It's not north versus south. It could be south as a metaphor or as an indication of marginality or weakened groups or oppressed groups in the north. It could be powerful groups in the south. So it is a reference to a colonial world that is now progressing and changing, very slow, by the way. But it could be, I make the point, it could be that these categories are temporary. You know, it could be that there will be such a change in the world where the South may be richer and more powerful than the North. It happened in history, and then these categories will no longer hold. But as long as this kind of disparity and colonial relations linger on, it has value. Now then come the idea of the East. So the first perhaps decade of this scholarship was all about South, global South, South versus North, South and North. And people in the Middle East or Eastern Europe or even Far East were feeling uneasy about it because in the tropes and metaphors and also in the geographies, there's different cultures, different ideas, different processes of development. So there was an idea that we have to produce some, to break this kind of monolithic idea, which also is epistemologically symbolic, because it could be many Easts and many Souths, but just to avoid a sort of wrong impression of coherence. So of course there are various Easts, and in the conference we also had very interesting sections about what are Easts. East-West axis, North-South axis. It's about economics, it's about culture, it's about different types of control and regimes in the past. And of course, Middle East itself is a colonial term, right? Because in India, they call us West Asia, which is actually a better term. So we'll think about all these relations as being a product of power relations, as Edward Said so well produced. So in that respect, we have a few key points that came out from the discussion and from the book. One of them is the idea of pluriversalism. It's not invented now. Some scholars in like Arturo Escobar in South America, etc., already use these terms and the idea of decolonizing knowledge. So if we say knowledge is not universal, pluriversal is a very suggestive idea, epistemological idea, that there are different forces. They're still structural, they're still slow, institutional, and oppressive, but they're not only one. There's several others, and that's very much came out of the discussion. It's also produced a whole set of different ideas of what is the scale of theorization. And most scholars in the book, but also in the discussion, gravitate towards the mesoscale, that is not universal, but not also micro, that will do away with the possibility of generalizing, which is important. So some kind of meso-engaged theorization is what came out of the book, as most people prefer to look at this. Not to give away the idea of oppression, not to give give away the idea that we can generalize and we can talk, for example, about Middle Eastern city or Middle Eastern societies, but not claim that it's universal either. And some of the main terms that came out of these 2 decades of discussion, of course, I don't do justice to any of them, But insurgent citizenship or insurgent planning is already, Fahrenheit was saying, ordinary cities, self-constructed cities, peripheral urbanizations, urban encroachment of the ordinary, gray spacing, the whole idea of gray spacing, inverse coloniality, that is when the colonized have no choice but to come to the power, rather than the power extend itself through empires. Dynamic structuralism. Following the COVID pandemic, there was also the idea of a colonial city, that is through the corona pandemic, it was colonized again. And in the whole digital revolution too, there are plenty of new terms that come from the digital gap, the digital colonization of people, that actually their data is used without their permission at all by big companies, and then is used for their own profits and power. So data justice, for example, is a new term that is now coming to very much in the global South societies that are controlled by these big mega companies. The whole idea behind the critique of the global South and East and other tropes like decolonial planning is to improve, to regenerate, not just to resist, but to offer alternatives. And this is, I think, why we're planners, because we don't stay with the critique, we actually build on it, like Catalina so well described. Pedagogy, practice on the ground. For example, Gautam Band's article is about repair. How do we actually go to these millions of people that live in what so-called informal or unrecognized places, and we actually engage planning in repair, of course, changing the power relation as well, and of course to do with land allocation, resources, etc. So here the idea is not just sumud, which is very important, but tikkun. Tikkun is actually in our languages is something that's improving, even revolutionizing for the better. So the Gramscian trope is to be critical like the mind, but to also be optimistic like the heart, is very important, I think, for the combination of, and that typifies the Southeastern planning. And in the 2 minutes, 1 minute that I have left, I want to end with two quotes. One of them is by Jorge Borges, the great Argentinian author, that he writes about the Aleph. And the Aleph is a short story that every planner should read. It's about a person in Buenos Aires that developers offer him a lot of money to ruin the house, to demolish his house and build some tower there, but he refuses. So Borges comes and says, why do you refuse that? And the person takes him to the cellar. And he shows him this point in the cellar. And he said, you see, I found it as a child. I stumbled over it. And then when I opened my eyes, I saw the Aleph, the point in space that contains all other points. The only place on earth where all places are seen from every angle. So the Southern perspective here would say that every city is an Aleph. You don't just see one thing. You see all the different streams of powers and relations and pluriversal reality. And then you produce from the ground, you produce and conceptualize. And this is exactly the point of theorizing from the Southeast. But going back to Palestine and to the Bedouin people that I work with that live in the West Bank, in Gaza, in the Negev, I want to quote from one of the people I work with, Hassan Abu Quida, who is an activist, and he says about planning in Israel, they want our indigenous land, but don't want our bodies. They cannot swallow us, but cannot vomit either. They need our labor, but want our land. They want us to urbanize, but not to their cities. That's the segregation. They want us to modernize, but not to integrate. They want us to live like a shadow. And I think that's a perspective that comes from a periphery, from the Southeast, and that's something that we have to work very hard to correct in order to create better planning, better society. And it's only observable if you come and talk and be with the people and observe the world from the periphery. Thank you.
So Catalina and Farnak, whoever wants to go next. And if you also want to reflect on what Oren just said, please go ahead.
I could go ahead, keep the same kind of order. Oren, thank you very much. I really appreciate your what you shared with us. Okay, so Catalina, if okay, I don't think I would need 10 minutes, but I would go first and then you can follow. So on this question of prospect of emerging southeastern urbanism and the pressing issues for theorizing or theory doing, if you call it southeastern theorizing, I want to make 2 points. And in respect to the question, but I summarize it and then I hopefully develop it further. One is, okay, yes, there is need for Southern turn and disobedient knowledge making in planning theories. That's the first point. And I think it was very eloquently also discussed by Oren just now. And secondly, that this turn in theorization is not enough. It is necessary, but it's not enough. We need to build solidarities across geographic locations. And as academics, we can do that through engaged scholarship. So I hope I can get to these 2 messages in response to what are the urgent issues, emerging, issues for Southeastern theorizing. And in respect to the first point, and yes, we do need to have to create disobedient knowledge. I think Catalina's concept of cardinal subordination is very important here. And borrowing from Divine Fu at UCT, University of Cape Town Humanities Center, he talks about disobedient knowledge, and in the African context explains that this involves turning African ideas and philosophies into methodologies, tools, and ways of thinking as an alternative to the universalized Eurocentric methodologies and ways of knowing, exactly the way that Oren was explaining how we generalize Northern or European or Western knowledge, but we always call what comes from South as case study. And that is the irony of it. So disobedient knowledge comes with its own methodologies, epistemologies, through co-creation of knowledge, that we create the knowledge together, not only in academia, not only in one location, but how we can have processes of co-creating knowledge, and as well as creating new vocabularies and imaginaries. I want to, for my short time here, just focus on that 2 points, the imaginaries and vocabularies. I think decolonizing planning imaginary is very important. And I have in the volume that actually Vanessa Watson and others edited on planning theory, extensively written about that one of the victories of neoliberal capitalism has been to colonized imagination of an alternative urbanism, alternative cities, alternative way of being. And that is really the terrain of imagining alternative futures has been a territory of fierce struggle between imagining the otherwise, what Catalina was referring to, or not seeing that there is any alternative to the dominant capitalist models of urbanism. This is imagination is an important territory that enemy has occupied, and language has been an important artillery in their warfare. Occupying forces are not only military, they also function by taking over and dominating our imagination and misappropriating our vocabulary. We don't have to go far to see in our colonial present moment language and vocabulary weaponized in a struggle for power, in creation of fear and silencing. So in planning, I think it has been very important what Gautam in his seminal writing has tried to kind of decolonize planning vocabularies and think about what are the alternative vocabularies, and what was just referred to as an initiative that I hope we see it seriously continued and built on, to build our own alternative vocabularies. In planning, often we sugarcoat, we cover the violent processes by calling it otherwise, calling it, for example, if you want to call it by what it is, call it for the way it is. We wouldn't call it gentrification, which is a fancy name. We should call it dispossession. We shouldn't call it mixed use planning, because in often cases when it's called mixed use planning is actually displacement. So in many ways we can start exposing by coming up with vocabulary that calls things for what they are rather than conceit. Going to my second and final point is that theorizing and having, theorized from clear positionality of the South is important, but as I mentioned, is necessary but not enough. We need to also share our disobedient co-created knowledges, and that is urgent as an agenda of Southeastern theorizing. Ken Salo at U of I, together with Greg Reuters at University of Western Cape, and Tishimani Center for Activist Education, also at currently placed at University of Western Cape, are having an initiative that I am part of, creating a citizenship commons or citizens commons. These are important initiatives in finding how we can create repertoire of resistance, infrastructure of resistance, gene pools of alternative decolonial practices of planning, and bring these together. Catalina works with the wealth of observations on the ground, co-creating knowledge and learning from practices on the ground in Colombia context, let's say. And Orent has a wealth of experience similarly working with Bedouins and and so on and so forth. Is there a way in which we can create these citizens commons, that we could bring these knowledges, these disobedient knowledges and ways of doing, methodologies, epistemologies, to be shared with each other? And in that way, we create a power that we can maybe not just limit ourselves to theorizing and knowing, but also formulating ways of changing, ways of forms of action. And we need that really, such a space of sharing to facilitate and build transnational solidarities. We cannot defeat this beast that is dividing and conquering all the time without creating solidarities across geographic locations. When we see Jewish Voices for Peace in the US or Jews for Palestine in South Africa, and movements like Israeli-based Women Wage for Peace based in Israel, working together with Palestinian-based women's groups, marching together for peace. These actions are important acts of solidarity through which we can then gain the force to have any hope for a future. So let's, emphasize that this usefulness of Southeastern turn in theories is very limited without the strategies to co-produce knowledge and promote transnational solidarities. And these are the most pressing and urgent issues for decolonial theorizing, and we should work on that direction are my messages. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll follow then. Thank you so much for your inspiring words, Oren and Faranak. For me, it's an honor to be actually next to you, and I've learned a lot from you. But I've been, always kind of thinking along those lines of how, the what for of what we do, and how can we expand, not only that circle that was discussing, but also how you move into praxis and how you create this kind of infrastructure of care with one another as something essential also to move forward in times where we are, witnessing a lot of hardship, to actually have critical voices out there. And I think something that I've been thinking a lot lately is, what is the weight of bearing witness in these times? And what is the role of theory, but also in our practice itself? I think there has been a lot of work around necropolitics, the spatial project of settler colonialism. But I wonder to what extent then part of the horizon and the prospects of theorizing from the Southeast, or the Southeast theorizing, has also to engage and expand our understanding of spatial violence, to understand more its logics, but also to understand how we can work towards dismantling it. And I think the issues of land grab needs to be central to this, and all the strategies to dismantle land grab strategies, I think, need to be having more space, and perhaps as a self-reflection, that is something that I would like to see more in our agendas. And also having a space to bring discussions about social rage, grief, which currently our theorizing practices are not giving much space for it, to be part of our discussions. And I think something that also is crucial at the moment, we know that when we did this was just right before the pandemic, and some of the things have changed, but some others kind of remain the same, but most of the more critical ones have been just exacerbated. Faranak didn't mention, but I think her work has been very important, and seminar to understand practices of radical care, which I think are crucial to shape how we position ourselves, but also, what do we study and who do we work with? And I think that theme in a way became to stay. And I think care is changing also the way we see each other, and also how the cities produce in terms of the territorial circuits, but also more particularly in the solidarity networks that is actually sustaining and expanding. And I think the other element that, I totally agree with this idea of disobedience, but particularly, learning from the discussions about epistemic disobedience that Mignolo has brought even late, like back in the 90s. I think a lot of what we do is trying to articulate how to connect how to make a praxis of epistemic disobedience, of refusal and the investment of the forces that do harm, and try to shift that in terms of focusing in more life-affirming infrastructures, and try to bring life at the center, right? What does it mean when we see through the lenses of life and the sacredness of life in the face of these devastating forces of death? And I think something that I've been learning, and after I wrote this piece about cardinal insubordinations, and in my work in Colombia particularly, we are in a brief period where talking about peace seems something that could be possible. So there's some room for hope. And I also wonder to what extent part of the agenda of the theoriSE project also need to think seriously how to bring together ideas and strategies, and perhaps like Faranak suggested, how can we support each other to actually enact radical hope and push forward ideas of, a radical imagination. Imagination is our tool and is our weapon at the same time. And I think sometimes we are not rehearsing the freedoms that we need to encapsulate in imagining a world otherwise. And the work of many of the groups that I have worked with, particularly coming from Colombia, from Mexico, have been teaching me that we cannot, we need to embrace a lot of the anti-colonial feminist work that thinks and understands violence also through the lenses of the body itself, and poses the concept of body, territory, earth to trying to understand this continuum and how can we think through it, both methodologically, empirically, but also politically, to actually understand and change the practices. So I've been learning a lot and trying to think also through the lenses of this idea or this notion that I've been working around the idea of territorial healing, because I think reparative justice needs to be something that is very central to what we do. And not only talking about the space, the spatial justice, but all the layers that are intertwined in this process and in this project that theoriSE can bring, help to bring forward, but also beyond that, and trying to establish those translocal networks of solidarity. So I think some other thinkers and workers and practitioners that are also illuminating the work, like Arturo Achinte, he helped us with the notion of re-existence, like going beyond resistance and trying to imagine a different type of existence. And these days, with concepts like humanity and the human has been brought around, I wonder to what extent we need to be thinking also going to both the philosophy and the front line, working with the front line, people that are in the front lines of the struggles, to actually learn from them, be part of that journey, as most of you and many of the people that are with us today that are more accompanying and working with rather than just writing about. And I think that change of position it needs to produce a different type of practice. But I think my message is urging to try to craft an academia otherwise, the one that is not detached from the people, that working particularly with the ones that are in the front lines, but also we need to think how to actually carve out of spaces to take care of each other, particularly in these very dark times. So thank you.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions already in the Q&A session, but before that, I would just like to mention certain things I was thinking. I mean, you mentioned the word about hope, dignity. These are not just something we are only speaking within southeastern planning theory, but I mean, Association of European School of Planning, their annual Congress. I remember in 2 different years, the theme was on dignity and hope. So we are still speaking about these ideas in the mainstream planning. And then we spoke about imaginaries. So I always think this is one of the things, like you have a picture of a wealthy community in your mind, which probably was introduced through neoliberal movement. But that has to change. And this is somewhere where imaginaries would play a very strong role. So we have actually a couple of questions. We can start with, I don't know if it's, yeah. So the first one is from Ken Sado. Thanks for the thoughtful and grounded presentations on the importance of subordinate perspectives for praxis of emancipatory planning projects. Can presenters say more about strategies of subordinate people to decouple or subvert dominant ideas or master narrative that conflate anti-Semitism with Zionism in solidarity with struggles for free Palestine from Jordan River to the Med Sea? So we could probably take one by one question. Anyone would like to comment on that? Probably.
Different order?
Yeah, go ahead.
I could respond to that briefly. I think it resonates very much with my observations and experience being based in the US academia. I don't know what is the landscape in other parts of the world, but in US academia, this colonization, you could say, appropriation, misappropriation of vocabulary and words has been an incredibly important weapon to silence people. Collapsing anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism has been the main way in which, in my observations, in academia at least, and in general public, they have silenced people because they have said, being against Zionism, you are anti-Semitic. And that is not true. Zionism is a political ideology, a political project that you can be critical of. And it doesn't mean that if you are critical of the state of Israel, right? You are critical or you are anti-Semitic. So, and this is, I think, has been really the witch hunt that in academia is going on. Like now they are summoning the president of Harvard and UPenn and MIT to Congress to defend why they allowed anti-Semitic protests on their campus. And these were not anti-Semitic protests. They were pro-Palestinian or against Israel, the genocide of Israeli state. It has nothing to do with being anti-Semitic. So I think there we can see how vocabulary has been in the context of US and in the current context of ongoing colonization, weaponized as a way of silencing. And I think it is very important, every opportunity, people who want to speak up, say that I am against Zionism as a project that has made Israel the most unsafe place on earth for our Jewish sisters and brothers. But that doesn't mean that I am anti-Semitic. And I think that is a very important, dangerous conflation and play with vocabulary that we should, as in solidarity with civilians, innocent people of Israel and civilians, innocent people of Palestine, always reiterate. So that was my 2 cents.
Oren or Catalina, would you like to add?
Yeah, well, I'd like to follow that, Faranak. It's very important. Both in Israel, Palestine, and everywhere, the battles on the ground, the violence, the spatiality is also always couched and framed in language. And this is very, very important. For example, even when they translate now in the war that we are in, when they translate resistance, quite often they translate it as terrorism, but it's not. You have mu'arada, you have mukawama, you have kifah musalah, you have all these different terms in Arabic. And I think myself, I oppose terrorism, but I don't oppose, I support resistance. So I think this is where the language, when it translated to English or to Hebrew or to other languages, is very, very critical. And the same with planning, innovation, renewal, development. If you oppose the dispossession of people, they frame you as opposing development or opposing innovation or opposing progress, right? So it's a battle of the language as well. And we have to come up, like I said before, we have to come up with all these critical terms, but also with alternatives, right? For example, a just space, our city, shared, commoning. We have a lot of language that we can actually build a professional cooperation and solidarity about reimagining the future. Just like this picture behind me. I'm sorry, I'm returning to it because this is just behind, but I have 100 pictures like this of spatial oppression that we need to actually couch it in the right term and to present alternative. And I'd like to think in the book, it's not stressed enough. In my introduction, I write about it and some other people, but there's a new cloud of colonization coming. And this is the digitalization of society has enormous power. Just think about in the Day for Palestine about Elon Musk saying anybody who's writing from the river to the sea will be struck off from Twitter, from X. Imagine what kind of oppressive dictatorial power is on the language that we use. And from the river to the sea is just geographical. It's not even anti-Semitic or any term. So just think about in many arenas how the digital, there is surveillance, there is a collection and harvesting of the data. There's infrastructure of who can access and who is not. Think about the new wave of colonization that we have to think in our cities, how to resist it, to offer alternatives. And I'd like to refer again to TWAIL. It's just an organization I think has done a really good work. And Raj Balakrishnan is part of our team. I hope he's listening now. He's, by the way, now he's a UN rapporteur for housing, and he started, this southern planning. But he's also part of TWAIL, and I went to a couple of the conferences. And this is hundreds of legal scholars and lawyers from what they call third world perspectives on international law. They actually presented, they created an alternative power, and this is what we have to do. They're organized, they get journals, they get conferences, they get appointments, they go and talk to governments. I think whatever we're going to call it, you know, justice in planning, global South planning, decolonial planning, there has to be organized, like Faranak was saying, but not just solidarity, but further than that. You know, we have to produce our own alternative field of knowledge, prestige, discourses, journals, delegations. And I think this is it's becoming more and more urgent as destruction and oppression continues. And, you know, I'd like to highlight again that it's not only North versus South and South versus North, but it's also South versus South. I mean, there is a lot of oppression in our countries that is no longer European, but the concept of justice, the concept of equality, the concept of commoning, and you can decolonize against your own people, like what's happening in Israel-Palestine. So I think this is where we need to build and take a leaf from TWEL and other organizations, social workers and other people in social science, historians that do present an alternative. They've organized themselves, they have institutions, they have journals, they have power in the academic world and in the practical and professional world. And I think this is the practical way to get, you know, to put the flesh over the bones of our ideas. And I'm very happy to continue to go along that trip in the next few years.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions. So I think there are two questions about what's the difference between global southeastern and global east and global south. The way I see it, and it's also written in the book, that the north-south is about economic domination and east-west is about culture and identity. So combining that, the term Oren and I think Vanessa, they came up with global south and east. I mean, we are calling southeastern here, but we also use that at south and east. Then we have a question or comment from Luna Kirfan. So thank you to all the speakers. I'm actually drawing on all your work as I teach an undergraduate planning theory course this term. One student at the end of one of the lecture relate that they are beginning to hate planning and to question their choice studying it. How can I support my students not to despair, especially when I myself am struggling to maintain some optimism for the future?
And Rima, do you mind if we cluster that with Magdalena's question that is also about teaching under the space of
Sure.
the university?
Okay. Sorry, So here it's, thanks Varna, Kathleen and Oren for sharing your always inspiring words. My question is very concrete. How do we apply these ideas to the classroom? Mainly how to prompt discussion on Palestine in Western classrooms. It feels so difficult, even to create a space where students feel safe to talk. I'm not from US, so it's still really challenging for me to believe that it's just not possible to discuss these ideas at university.
Let me start. You know, I'm passionate about pedagogy, and I think, you know, there's a whole, perhaps sometimes the only power we have is the power we have to be present in the life of people that are eager to learn. And I think there has been, particularly here in London and in UCL, we have gathered in the last weeks with workers, with academic staff, and with the students, trying to think what would be some avenues, right? And something that was clear is that we need to educate the people that are willing to learn more about it. And for that, there's a sort of, you know, there's several toolkits, resources for learning about and learning with. And I think perhaps some of the work is very interesting that the Funambulist is putting forward. They have done some teach-ins about this process in terms of understanding from the perspective of a space and spatial practices, you know, what is the project of settler colonialism? And, you know, just by listening or viewing those videos or reading a particular text, that is kind of, you can start at least opening the discussion for people that perhaps are not familiar at all with the circumstances, but most importantly, trying to connect how that is vital to understand even our own position in the whole debate, and trying to connect with other elements, right? Because everything is intertwined, and trying to understand and make connections with the actual everyday life of the people that sit in the classroom. The other strand that emerged in this discussion across campus on the solidarity campaign, let's say, that we are promoting, is that also the necessity for only spaces that center Palestinian voices, spaces of care, and spaces for grieving and organizing and channeling rage and despair. And I think that is another strand, you know, that goes beyond the usual classroom setting, and is also a maintenance and, you know, and the part of the duty of care that we have with our students that feel directly affected by this. Those are just my two very practical strategies that I can think of when and how to start addressing, particularly with the crowds that either don't know enough about it, don't feel moved about it, or the ones that are absolutely hit emotionally and personally by that.
I could add my very little to what Catalina eloquently discussed, and that is maybe for both questions in terms of students who start hating planning and difficult conversations around Palestine and Israel. I think that the expanding or focusing on vocabulary, that could be the way in which we could help our students grapple with this. Students who say, I am hating planning, we have to challenge them, what kind of planning? Planning is not only the kind that is done X. If you're, the whole struggle, I think, of this generation of planning academics that we have been writing about, insurgent planning, bottom-up planning, you know, all of that, has been to expand so that when we say planning, we are very clear, professionalized planning and other, you know, grassroots planning, citizens planning, etc. So I think that would be an important point to say, maybe what you are resenting now is a particular form of planning that you are being critical, but this is not the only way you can be involved in planning. There are a whole range of actors involved in planning, and we need to recognize and be part of that. So I think that is a way in which we could engage with those students. And the second point, I think, is again the vocabulary. If we help the students to see how their vocabulary is being taken away from them, and therefore when you can't talk with each other because your words are taken away and I misappropriate, misinterpret it, yes, it becomes very hard to hold the conversation. But if the starting point is to redefine, then we see that we have maybe more similarity than difference, or we can easier find our common grounds. That's my suggestion again, to go back to terms and vocabulary and colonization. Thank you.
Well, I think it's a good question. I think a lot of people despair when they see the power structure and the way the world is going. So first of all, from my perspective of age, I can tell people, everybody knows that things never go linearly, they go back and forth, and there's always hope and there's always struggle. Things you think can be shown to have been much worse, to have been much better. So this is a global South perspective, you know. There's no salvation right out there. There's just ongoing struggles, ongoing incremental achievements, and some failures. And I think as a philosophy, that's healthy to think about the world as moving in all kind of ongoing struggles and partial improvements. Now, I want to say that planning in general, like both my colleagues said, you know, had a lot of crimes, let's say crimes. Planning has displaced people, has dispossessed people, has colonized people. But planning has another aspect. We already mentioned it. Actually, the raison d'etre, where planning comes from, it originated, it comes to the world during the disaster of the industrial cities, during the illness and terrible health problems and density and pollution in the 19th century, more or less. And it improved living conditions for many people. And this is actually the DNA, the philosophical DNA, not the practical. Much like, say, medicine. You know, the task of the medical profession is to make people healthier. The task of teachers is to make people smarter. The task of planning is to make cities and societies better. Now we are hijacked by developers, by governments, but people that study planning should remember this is the DNA of our profession and struggle for it in association, in code of conducts, in ethics, in committees. I do it all the time. Usually I'm in the minority, but I remind people, say in the regional communities, in the national community, in the courts, they hesitate a bit because they see themselves as doing good, right? And when you expose to themselves some of the crimes and the injustices that are made in their name, it's a problem. So there is a struggle there about the character of the profession, architecture, planning, geographer. In the classroom, I'm a little bit different to my colleagues here, maybe because I'm on the ground. I always start with meeting people. I always start with either having people from these different communities come to the class, even people that you oppose, not criminals, of course, but people that you oppose, maybe that have very different ideologies. We go to these communities, we talk to them, and then we read and we build, just like the Southeastern perspective, we build the concept towards the end of the semester, towards the end of the year. We're not shunning away from thinking about Marxism and patriarchy and colonization, but we get to these theories after we meet people and after we, the horns come off and the actual people-to-people contact whenever it's possible. It makes it easier for people to engage with people that they think they are the big enemies or they are the great evil. It doesn't mean that they change their opinions greatly, but it is in a classroom situation, in a studio situation, it allows people to come together through the humanity without great illusions, but it is a practice that for many years I've found helpful and also making people come together towards common ground of improving the situation, the spatial and planning situation. Very difficult this year, of course. We haven't started the year yet because of the war. Our semester is starting late in December. It will be very challenging, but I'm going to stick to it as well. No other way is by to meet the people and recognize the humanity and recognize the common ground that we all stand for, even if we have conflict.
Thank you very much, Oren. We are actually very out of time right now. So we have tried to answer most of the questions. There were a few questions about decolonization versus anti-colonization and neoliberalism. So we will continue the discussion in future through writings and work, and you can find it here. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for